Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being with us today. My name is Cécile Ollivier, and I'm Aparito Chief Innovation Officer. It's my pleasure and honor to be with you today, and I would also like to particularly thank the organizer and speakers for putting together this webinar under short notice. As we all know, pediatric research raises recognized specific challenges. However, over the past months, due to the pandemic crisis and its impact on children and their families' safety primarily, pediatric research has been facing more challenges than ever. But we have also witnessed over the past months great collaboration and innovation in the pediatric community to overcome these challenges. It is therefore with great pleasure that I Act for Children and Aparito have worked together to address today's important topic about remote patient monitoring and children in the COVID-19 pandemic. We are honored and grateful to have experts with us today from US, Canada, and Europe who will be sharing their first-hand experience during the pandemic and their learnings. These experts also represent broad pediatric clinical trial network in their respective regions, namely I Act for Children, Connect for Children, and MyCern in Canada. They will be joined by Dr. Alexander from FDA to provide regulators' perspective on the topic, and Dr. Ellen Half-Davis, Aparito CEO, to present various examples on how technology can be used to the benefits of the pediatric population. Before moving to the discussion, we have a few housekeeping rules. So just to confirm that the webinar will be recorded and will be made publicly available once legal clearance has been confirmed. And also during the webinar, should you have any question, at the bottom of your Zoom window, there is a Q&A box where you can ask questions live. This question will be answered either in writing or will be addressed during the moderator discussion at the end of the presentations. I will now hand the floor to Dr. Gary Noel, who is I Act for Children Chief Medical Officer, who will moderate the presentation and discussion. We hope you will enjoy this webinar. Thank you.
And thank you, Cécile. I wanted to start off by thanking Aparito for organizing this webinar. We had certainly spoken with Aparito about the advances that are being made in remote monitoring that are being driven by the COVID pandemic. But I think as innovators in the area of pediatric clinical research, we recognize that remote patient monitoring could be a great opportunity for advancing the field. There are potential mechanisms involved in remote monitoring that can make our trial conduct more efficient, may encourage more diverse patient population enrollment. And so while we can look at this as a response in some ways to the COVID pandemic, I think we also will see over the course of the next 90 minutes that there are great opportunities here in using this technology to really make an important advance in how we conduct clinical trials. The Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children is a nonprofit organization based in the US. It is involved in both proprietary work as well as non-proprietary work. Our proprietary work has been with major pharmaceutical companies and members of the Institute who conduct clinical trials in a network that now involves 70 plus clinical sites, mostly in North America, but also in Australia, Latin America, and has extended relationships with networks throughout Europe, Canada, and most recently in Japan. We're pleased to learn that there are probably over 140 participants in this webinar, which I think demonstrates the substantial interest in this area. And we look forward not only to sharing information with you all, but also hearing your questions and getting your responses to this technology and how it might be helpful in doing the work that you do related to clinical research involving children. Before we start, we wanted to take a short poll. It's a 3-question poll, just to get a feel for what the experience is among the participants out there. We feel we'll show the results of this poll right before we begin our panel discussion, just to get a better feel for who's out there and what their experience has been. So can I ask you to look at these questions? They're simple yes/no answers. And as I said, I think this will be up during the course of the meeting. So we will show you the results of that as we get towards the end. Do I need to spend more time or leave this up, or do we go on to?
We need to wait.
Let's leave it on for
leave it on. Okay. So as you're looking at that, the way this meeting will run is I'm going to briefly introduce the 5 speakers, or like it's 6 speakers who will be sharing information with you, and also introduce the one panel member, Mark Turner, who is not giving a formal presentation, but has agreed to help as a panelist in discussing the topic. So our first speaker, Brianna Stewart, is an Associate Director for Clinical Trials in the MyCERN Canadian Pediatric Clinical Trial Network. She plays a critical role in ensuring that MyCERN is able to build child family-centric research and has educational capabilities. She also works as a research coordinator and project manager at the University of Alberta. And she will be sharing her experience and her group's experience in remote patient monitoring that's occurring in MyCERN. Our next speakers will be Emily De La Reyes and Sherry Holmes-Farley. They're both from Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. Nationwide Children's Hospital is a member of the IAC Clinical Trial Network. Dr. De La Reyes is a clinical professor of pediatrics and neurology. She runs and directs the Batten Disease Center for Excellence and is a leader in the neurodevelopment clinic there at Nationwide. Her research focuses on the development of therapeutic approaches for neurodegenerative diseases, and she'll be joined by Sherry Holmes-Farley, who, as I said, is also at Nationwide Hospital. She's a pediatric nurse with 31 years of experience, most recently working specifically with Batten disease children. And both Dr. De La Reyes and Ms. Farley will be sharing their experience as it relates to working with this specific patient population, addressing some of the challenges that have presented themselves and how they've moved forward to address those challenges at Nationwide. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Mariana Vivarelli, who is a member of the Division of Nephrology at Hospital Bambino Gesù. She has performed basic clinical and translational research throughout her career, initially focused on immune-mediated renal diseases. She's successfully contributed to many clinical trials, and she's been an important contributor to C4C network. She'll be sharing her experience within the renal kidney network that she has been leading in, which is part of the overall C4C initiative. And then we'll hear from Dr. Ellen Hough-Davies, who's the founder and CEO of Aparito. Dr. Davies received her PhD from University College of London. That work was focused on the development of age-appropriate disease-specific biomarkers and clinical endpoints in neurometabolic diseases. She's worked at the European Medicines Agency for 6 years before founding Aparito in 2015. And she will be sharing with us Aparito's work, which is focused on the development of patient-centric digital outcomes to support decentralized trials and remote monitoring of patients who are enrolled in those trials. And then the last speaker will be Dr. John Alexander, who is the Deputy Director of the Division of Pediatric and Maternal Health in the Center of Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. He's worked at the FDA since 1995. He is a pediatrician and has had several roles within the FDA, including that of a medical officer and team leader in the Division of Anti-Infective Products. And Dr. Alexander will be sharing his thoughts on the topic of remote monitoring as it comes from the perspective of an FDA regulator. And then lastly, as I mentioned, Dr. Turner will be joining us as a panelist. Dr. Turner is a senior lecturer in neonatal medicine at the University of Liverpool, a director of research and development at Liverpool Women's National Health Foundation Trust. As many of you know, Mark has played a critical role in the development of C4C and is a very active leader in that organization. He has responsibilities for the continued development and implementation of the C4C network. So what I'll be doing now is handing the microphone, if you will, over to Brianna Stewart. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes to present their thoughts and share their experience. If we have time in that 10 minutes, we may open it up for some questions. More likely, I'll probably use those 10 minutes to share those experiences, and then we will address questions later on in the panel discussion. So, Brianna, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and for being a part of this wonderful webinar and for you guys organizing it all. So can we go to the next slide, please? I'm just going to start with talking about the current landscape of where we're at right now here in Canada. Most of our research units, which we have 17 child health academic centers that we represent at MyCERN, most of those units are currently in the ramp-up phase of clinical research, so we're just starting to open things back up again. Majority of our units shut down research except for essential studies, which were COVID studies, and those studies where patients were already coming in for clinical care. So in terms of remote patient monitoring, we have kind of a limited experience. There wasn't a ton of patients that required a lot of remote monitoring. They either came in for their essential clinical trial care or those studies were put on hold and they didn't happen. So I'm going to give an overview of kind of where we're at right now and some of the ways that we've implemented virtual clinical trials and patient monitoring, but just keep in mind that for most of our units, research was kind of at a halt. And as I said, we're starting to ramp back up right now. So most of our research staff are encouraged to work from home. So that's also created some challenges, especially as it relates to patient data and doing the quality assurance monitoring visits. When the patients do come into the clinics for their care, certainly the COVID restrictions have required us to have PPE in place and social distancing measures. And then in terms of clinical trials, we certainly had to shift our on-site monitoring visits to be electronic Zoom visits and same with our qualification and site visits. So next slide, please. Quick overview again from a Health Canada perspective. We received an interim order from Canada's Minister of Health that allowed for flexibilities in the way that we conduct clinical trials and medical devices as a result of COVID, and it really reduced and lightened the administrative burden on the sites and the sponsors, and it allowed for us to have more decentralization of the clinical trials to allow multiple sites and remote sites and involve a broader range of healthcare practitioners into the conduct of the trial. And then the biggest thing for us here in Canada was it allowed for more remote and non-written consent when appropriate, which really helped us facilitate these virtual clinical trials. Next slide, please. So overall, COVID-19 changes in terms of clinical trials, we had changes to our ethics reviews. So they went from in-person meetings to virtual meetings, which allowed for us to have, especially the COVID clinical trials, up and running a little bit quicker. The board was still able to meet at their normal frequency. We didn't have to really postpone the ethics board reviews. And then in terms of recruitment, we kind of did some novel things. We were able to contact patients either with an intermediary of the health system or directly if it related to COVID. So COVID positive patients, in some circumstances, we were able to contact patients directly without having that intermediary, which allowed us to enroll patients a little more quickly into clinical trials. Next slide, please. And then as I said, consent, verbal, verbal and e-consent are now allowed at most of the institutions, and we're changing our SOPs to be able to accommodate that. Our ethics boards were a little bit hesitant and resistant before, but with the changes coming at Health Canada, we're able to do that. Study visits then went more remotely when we were able to. We also allowed for some home visits. And then in terms of study drug, we got to be creative and do some curbside pickup of study drug, as well as deliver some of the medication to patients' homes, where we had to be mindful about the temperature monitoring. So it added an extra element, but it didn't make clinical trials be impossible during COVID. So that's kind of a brief overview, and I'm going to give an example of all of these pieces kind of at the end here. Next slide, please. So in terms of virtual visits, majority of our virtual visits, if we have to make them in terms of patient safety, are by telephone consultation. That's the preferred method if we're able to do that. So you can kind of see the diagram there at the bottom, the triage chart about if you can do a clinical trial consult via telephone, then we do that. If you require materials, then we switched more to an enterprise Zoom platform, which met our encryption and security needs. But I do want to point out that here in Canada, we have a population density that's very low. So especially for pediatrics, patients are spread all over the country. So we've been using a lot of these telehealth technologies for a long time. And there's an example there, 2014, Child Health BC had the Technology Enhanced Access Children's Care program, which really focused on two work streams. So one of them was to be able to have, it's a first of its kind in Canada, which used digital equipment to link local teams caring for critically ill children with real-time intensivist support and guidance to the more remote locations. And then as well, it allowed us to enhance the enhancement of telehealth connectivity in communities around the province that patients were in more remote areas. So we've definitely been using these virtual platforms. They've been in existence for us and we utilize them. So going to COVID and monitoring our patients, we're still able to build off of these. I would say that the newer thing that has come in for us is this virtual health with the Zoom encryption and enterprise. We're able to still share visual materials with patients over a secure platform. Next slide, please. I also wanted to share with you another example, which is COVID specific to pediatrics here in Canada, which isn't in terms of research necessarily. The program was implemented for clinical care, and that was at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, where they have virtual visits for their emergency department. They offer virtual care by appointment on the triage request form. So parents and patients can go online and complete this triage form. They go through matrices of questions of whether it's applicable or not. So depending on what's happening with the patient, it may or may not be an appropriate scenario, but it certainly allows patients to still get the care that they need while being at home and not having to travel into the hospital and again, minimize risk. And so the way that these visits occur is patients book an appointment, and appointments on this triage platform are 7 days a week, offered between 1 p.m. and 9 p.m. And registration clerk contacts those patients that submit their triage form within 30 minutes, unless it's after 11:30 p.m. And then those patients are set up in secure Zoom platforms to have meetings with the physician or nurse practitioner, or however that's set up. So that's another example too that we can certainly use. We haven't used this in a pediatric clinical trial platform yet with this, but it's certainly something that we could consider using in the future. Next slide, please. So the last thing that I want to talk about here is about virtual clinical trials and bringing all these pieces of technology together. Now, as I mentioned, most of our pediatric clinical trials were put on hold unless they were essential, and in that case, those patients came in. But I did want to share with you an example that I thought that I had participated in as a research coordinator that really shows an example of how you can function and use technology in terms of a virtual clinical trial and apply it to a pediatric context. So we have possibilities of how things can be done now, and we can look to some of these other experiences and use them moving forward. So in Alberta, I had participated in a randomized control trial with hydroxychloroquine in using that in early treatment of COVID-positive patients with the outcome to try and prevent severe symptoms and hospitalization. So in this particular clinical trial, everything was done remotely. All of our staff worked from home. All of our patients remained in their home, and it worked really, really well. There was lots of lessons learned. So it started with patients tested positive for COVID-19 were contacted by our health system. So Alberta Health Services did provide the intermediary. So when patients were notified of their positive COVID test, they also were asked if they were interested in participating in a clinical trial. So patients that were interested, they got put into a randomizer, and the system that we used was called Diamind. And it was the central hub for patients and their contact information. So it was a secure platform that all the patients had their contact information as part of. And so the study coordinators, they were all at home, able to log into this Diamind system and get the patient list for the day. So patient lists were uploaded twice a day, depending on the number of COVID cases. So once in the morning and once in the afternoon. And our research coordinators logged in, and they got the potential patient's phone number, and they were able to contact them through this randomizer system. Next slide, please. So the way that patients were contacted was with the virtual platform called Pure Cloud, and it allowed us to do oral consent. So patients, the study coordinators walked through the consent form that was provided to these patients via email from the health system's virtual team. So we called the patients, and it was recorded. So consent was recorded so that the study monitors for the clinical trial could go back and ensure that consent and informed consent actually happened. So we walked through a list of questions with the patients to ensure that they understood what was happening. We obtained patient identifying information to ensure that we had the appropriate patient. And then the consent was captured into the online database of REDCap. So this was all double documented and recorded. And then at the same time, while the patients were on the phone, we were able to log into our electronic health record system to verify inclusion-exclusion criteria, look at their lab work, confirm medications that they were on to ensure that they met the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And then at the same time, with that Pure Cloud system, we were able to third party in a physician if we needed a consultation from a physician. So in terms of patient safety and answering questions, patients really got the opportunity to have these physicians available to them. And for the research team, we had access to the patient's chart to ensure that they were being enrolled appropriately. Next slide, please. Now, the other piece that we use technology here to ensure patient safety and that patients are really informed in these clinical trials was language line. So in Canada, we have a very diverse, multicultural population. And so we had a wide range of languages that needed translation. And so we were able to third party in a language line to translate all of the informed consent forms. As well, on our research team, we also had clinical trial coordinators that had second languages. So they were able to communicate the messages in the context of a clinical trial, a little bit more than just direct translation. So that was great. So then what happened is patients that had agreed to participate and provided their oral informed consent, they received this study in that randomizer that I talked about with Diamind. They were randomized, and the drug was dispatched through one of the couriers that we have here. And the dispatches went out twice a day because this was a time-sensitive drug trial. They went out twice a day, and patients would receive the medication at their doorstep and right to their door. And then our study team would contact them when they received the medication, or we got notification from the dispatch that it had been safely delivered. And then we would go through dosing instructions again with these patients. So then the last piece of how we use technology to ensure patient safety was through our SPOR data platform, where we obtained administrative health data that went directly into our REDCap electronic database. And so all the SAEs, hospitalizations, all of those SAEs were automatically pulled into our database. So we were notified on a daily basis if our patients ended up in hospital to help capture our primary outcome. And again, in terms of patient safety, being able to monitor what was happening. So this was a really great example of a virtual clinical trial. Again, it's in an adult population, but certainly there was a lot of lessons learned and software platforms that we use that we can apply to a pediatric trial now moving forward. And we're starting to look at trials like that as we head into a potential second wave here. Next slide, please. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention too that the other ways that we use technology to ensure that we were giving the best care to the patients that were in the clinical trials was through our team meetings on a Microsoft Teams platform. So we met on a daily basis to talk about challenges or experiences that patients had provided to us to make sure that we're very consistent in delivering the same message to all of our patients. In terms of starting up the clinical trial very efficiently, we used DocuSign for electronic signatures. And as well, all of our scheduling of our staff and physicians was through Google Sheets. And so we were able to do everything completely remotely. And next slide, please. So the biggest takeaways from this is that software platforms allow for direct to patient research. It increased our enrollment when we were able to contact patients really quickly and efficiently. Patients that were isolated were still able to participate in clinical trials remotely and be active participants in that. And the biggest things in terms of patient monitoring is that they had access to physicians 24/7. We had an on-call team, and if patients were experiencing any concerns, we could call them on that Pure Cloud phone line and make sure that all of their questions were answered and that everything was being done safely. So that's the presentation that I have today. And thank you so much for allowing me to share my experience. And these were some really great lessons learned. We're certainly moving into the wave of technology here and seeing the possibilities and making sure that our patients are done, so everything's done safely as we provide our best care for them in these clinical trials. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brianne. And we don't have time for questions right now, but we will at during the panel discussion. Our next speakers are Dr. De Los Reyes and Ms. Farley from Nationwide Children's Hospital. So Emily, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hi, good morning to everybody. And I think because Europe is involved here, good afternoon to the rest of the world. I am the primary investigator for our Batten's Clinic research platforms. Next slide, please. These are my disclosures. Next slide, please. So Batten's disease or neuronal cerebral lipofuscinosis is the most common cause of dementia in children and adolescents. It is a lysosomal storage disease with more than 100 molecular mutations and more coming each day with 13 presumed genes. It is autosomal recessive. And in the old days, we were able to find this out by performing skin biopsies, which you can see on the right. And what you see is accumulation of lipopigments called lipofuscin. Next slide, please. So this is an ultra rare disorder. And we, as I mentioned before, we have 13 genotype phenotype correlations. So about, we have 14 IRB protocols, but 5 are clinical trials. And so this is a, when COVID happened, I slowed down for 1 week. But after that, it is 3 of our trials are what we call intraventricular enzyme therapy trials. So we put the enzymes in a port in the brain. So obviously the patients had to come in, and we did not slow down at all for that. Most of our patients are from outside Ohio, but they had to move for this particular trial, for the CLN2 trial. And so again, I think we slowed down literally for a week. But the intraventricular enzyme therapy trials kept on happening. Also, we have 2 separate trials that are gene therapy trials. So again, these are ultra rare and very innovative. So we could not, that part, we had to make sure the children are safe. Again, we had to really kickstart the innovation of how to get a hold of families, how to have this available, because this is not happened for we are the only gene therapy site for CLN6 and CLN3. And then we currently have 2 natural history studies. Because these are rare disorders, half of our patients are international. So also in Europe and sometimes and in the United States. Next slide, please. So because these are gene therapy trials, these are phase 1-2 studies. And as anybody in our audience knows, phase 1 means safety, safety, safety. So we had, you know, for safety, a fair amount of that is making sure that the children are clinically safe. But on the other side, if they are in Europe, we had to make sure that we could still do our blood work. The good part is we're able to, even before COVID, we had access for the patients for the blood work just in case there is an adverse event and we want to make sure that this is related to the gene therapy or and we had access to the labs and the parents knew. We also, as part of our consents, we are able to access and discuss the cases with their primary care physicians. Now, one of the challenges is or good things about EU is it's nationalized medicine. So we had to make sure that in certain cases where the insurance has to be paid for, we had to make sure that the parents can probably get the blood work and we reimburse them for our studies. So within a week, we actually, Nationwide Children's was able to convert clinical and research in terms of telemedicine. We had that platform on hold and was waiting, and it transformed within a week. So even from a clinical side, we were calling patients, making sure, because in neurology, we take care of a lot of rare, not just rare children, but children with epilepsy, headaches. So we had to make sure that they had access to us. So we were able to convert pretty immediately within about a week that we could have access. And we had what we call Zoom platform, but the Zoom platform had to be highly confidential. So it's not just the Zoom where you hang out with your families. It had to be Zoom through the hospital. And so that converted within probably around the second week. And as Ms. Farley will mention later, the protocol had to be our IRB was very quick. We had to do a COVID protocol changes, and so the IRB was very good about allowing us so that there was a ramp up of the work. So actually, I think our IRB was very busy during this time. They may be at home, but they were like, you know, all the amendments were coming in during this time. So with the help of the IRB, we were able to perform amendments, and not just we had sponsors for the trial. So as you can see, although we were at home, we were having meetings for amendments and consents within the first 2 weeks of COVID happening. And the beauty of very, very few things, the beauty of this era is that we're able to talk to each other pretty quickly within an email and then converting to a Skype or a Zoom. So all of this was happening. Next slide, please. So I will let Shelley go over what she had to go through for all this in coordination with us.
So as a coordinator, I'm responsible for getting the consents ready. And first off, we needed to do a verbal consent that they would be on camera. There was a possibility that it would not be secure, even though we were doing everything we could to keep it that way. And then we had to re-consent families because of the changes with the consent that we were going to be doing Skype visits, and also what developmental tools we could use when we saw them on video. So they had to do that. All of our patients that are out of the country do not speak English, so we had to make sure that we had an interpreter available. We were able to schedule these visits through our Epic system with a Zoom call. And when we schedule that, if they need an interpreter, they are automatically scheduled through our interpreting services so that everyone can join the call. our families were a little confused about the MyChart because they're usually needed to use a password and a logon. But when we do the Zoom calls, they don't. They just need to log into their MyChart and the visit will pop up with a camera. So we were able to do that. The protocol reconsents were a little bit lengthy because the consents are very long. We needed to make sure they understood all of it, so our interpreters had to help. And then to get a real signature, I then needed to send a consent to them, have them sign it, and then send it back to me. And then I had my consent that I had signed in the chart already. We put everything together. We do a QA process that those went through to make sure that they were up to standards. And that's how we handled that part. Next slide. So this is what their MyChart tool looked like. And they actually were sent directions ahead of time and how to do it. And the instructions were pretty clear to us, maybe not to them, because they ended up having some questions that we were pretty quickly able to answer and get them up onto the videos. We did this. You want to do that part?
Yeah, so I think what Shelley was talking about also is, you know, when we're hanging out with our families for Zoom, you just put a password in. This was extremely complicated. So I think Shelley and we would block off not just an hour at a time, maybe almost sometimes 2.5 hours, because sometimes the families will take, especially for families that are not used to what we call MyChart, which I think the other author before us recommended, was that, you know, it takes about 30 minutes just to access, you know, within that platform. Or some families with one click, they know exactly how to do it. So I could never tell, but we always had to give them that you know, benefit of the doubt. One challenge about this telehealth is we had to go to a redesign of the physical and neurologic exam. So again, for the physicians in this group, we cannot put a stethoscope out and listen to the heart or listen to the lungs. And so I'm a neurologist, so a fair amount of neurology is observation, actually. So when I walk in the room, I say hi, I talk to the patient, and literally, you know, these kids are very good at talking on FaceTime. So that's one good thing. I would say hi, and they would really get excited to see me. But at the same time, you know, we had to change how we did the neurologic exam. So with the help of multiple physicians who had, again, to innovate, we had telehealth from American Academy of Neurology, the Child Neurology Society. We had guidelines on what to do for our patients to ensure a good physical exam. Next slide, please. So study challenges. So the efficacy measures of my study are what we call scales. And one is a Hamburg scale, and one is called the Unified Batten's Disease Rating Scale. For the Hamburg scale, we just allow them to walk or talk. And so that was kind of easy for us. However, vision is hard because some of it, you have to flash a light. And obviously, we have to have the families use their phones, or, you know, and again, when you're doing visual exams, we kind of had to warn the families. So before the visit, we tell them, this is what to expect. This is what I need. We need toys. We need this. So we prepared the families for the visit. However, for the UBDRS, it's a very long kind of visit. I mean, a long exam. So there are certain parts that was very difficult. So we had to modify. Again, as part of the protocol, you know, cognitive measures, which are, you know, you can't really do cognitive measures, and they were not designed to be to be given over telemedicine, right? So we had to, again, innovate and try to see what we can do, but still it is a work in progress. I think for cognitive measures, we still are unable to perform a good cognitive process compared to, so sometimes we have to defer that and hope that COVID will get better and that the parents can start coming in. I think the author before us or the speaker before us talking about interpreting services, which can be challenging. For me, especially if you speak several languages, although I'm not fluent at all the languages, I think it would be interesting what everybody will think. Sometimes I know that it's not being interpreted correctly, and I'd have to back up and say, sorry, I want you to reinterpret. And so sometimes it's not 100% in terms of that is again a challenge that I think hopefully will get better in the future. And sometimes getting the interpreting services to blend in with the families is also difficult. I think Shelley and I have to go through that also. Sometimes our interpreting services may kind of drop off even, you know, because like what you were saying in Canada, you all had to work from homes. Like I'm in the hospital now because I'm afraid to give this talk from home because my trunk line, it may not be able to handle, you know, the this talk. So usually when I give lectures, I still come to work. I come to work a lot, but for lectures, I come to work especially because I am worried about the trunk line, you know, being able to speak and not drop off. Next slide, please. So we talked about this. Our secure platforms have to be vetted very securely by our IS, our informational service team. So I cannot just use the Zoom because, you know, we were looking at Zoom bombs. So we had to have a special Zoom that the hospital has to pay for. Our Skype reportedly is extremely secure. So that was where we started first in Skype, and then we moved on to Zoom. We had to record. So when part of my protocol is recording visits, so we have to have our IS team allow us to record. And like when you were talking about consents, we had triple consent. So we had consent through electronically. And then when they came in, I asked for consent verbally again, like, is this okay? You have to be in a private place. You can't be in a parking lot, because sometimes our patients are in a parking lot, or like going into a plane, you know, that's clinical. Research, no, you have to be at home. You have to be secure. And then now we have Microsoft Teams. So we have like access 3 times. And then we were recording families, and we had to explain to IS that this is a outcome because they were very worried about recording patients. And so again, with consent and secure access, we were able to perform that. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, this is my team in front of you. I think I am probably missing 1 or 2 people for our studies. But in conclusion, this is again a work in progress. I think I like innovations. Obviously, that's why I'm here. We're doing gene therapy, enzyme replacement therapy, very challenging work. We have 3 phases, and we're now in phase 3 of our studies, and so we continue to be challenged by our, you know, we have European families who are now coming in under humanitarian visas. However, sometimes when the embassy, they have to be in coordination with the embassy, say that, well, you're coming in, but if you get corona, what's going to happen? So those are still challenges for us. And as you know, we have certain portions of the US is, you know, our COVID is rising, so we have to balance safety with our families. But at the same time, I am very happy that we have access to teleservices so that I can sleep better at night, and my families can sleep better at night, knowing that we have access 24 hours. Thank you very much for inviting us, and it's a pleasure to hear the rest of the world and how they do things.
Well, thank you. And again, we don't have time for questions here. We're going to go on to the 3rd presentation. And we are falling a little bit behind in time, but we do have a half hour set up for panel discussions, which will probably need to be a little bit shorter than that. But our next speaker, Dr. Vivarelli, will now share with us her experience in a renal rare kidney disease network that she's been very much involved in. So Dr. Vivarelli?
Yes, hello, good afternoon and good morning, and thank you very much for allowing me to share our experience. So just a brief introduction. I work in a pediatric hospital called Ospedale Pediatrico Bambino Gesù, which is in Rome, in Italy, and it's the largest European pediatric hospital. And it also has a large clinical trial center and research facilities and a cellular therapy facility. So we really try to offer innovation and the best possible care to our patients. I also coordinate within the European Union has a platform for patients who are seeking, when they have a rare disease, the best centers and the centers that have the largest expertise for rare and ultra-rare diseases. And this network is called EARN, E-R-N, and within the EARNs, the one for the kidney is called ERCNet. And I coordinate the glomerular diseases immune-mediated group within this EARN. And this is excellent way of networking, both for the patients and their families, but also for physicians that are trying to perform clinical trials for rare and ultra-rare diseases. And I'm going to show and share with you an example of remote patient monitoring that we did in a multicentric Italian trial in children with a renal chronic disease called nephrotic syndrome. And in reality, this is something that we implemented before the COVID pandemic, but it can be an example that can be useful also within this situation. So the trial was called Propine, and it was a phase 3 study in which we enrolled 126 children with relapsing forms of nephrotic syndrome. And 10 Italian pediatric nephrology centers were enrolled. And essentially the objective of the study was to compare 2 different oral prednisone schedules. So these are children that have a disease in which they need to perform a urinary dipstick every day or every other day because they will relapse, and when their disease relapses, they have proteinuria. And so that can be detected easily at home with a urinary dipstick. And when they had a relapse, they would try one of the 2 schedules of oral prednisone that were part of the study. Next slide, please. So what we had thought, since it's a rare disease and it required 10 centers to have the numbers that were required to be able to have significant results, we thought that it would be really useful to try to facilitate long distance monitoring of the situation of the patient, both in terms of how the proteinuria was, and as you see, we can do the urinary dipstick, and also in terms of what dose of prednisone they were taking and safety, so all the different side effects that they could experience. And this was necessary to be done daily, while weekly we needed to obtain blood pressure and body weight. So normally these children are seen in clinic every 3 or 4 months, but we wanted to try to minimize the need for the patient to come into clinic and to try to have a way of monitoring the patient safely, but maintaining the patient at home as much as possible. So next slide. So what we did was that we designed with a company called Evolvo, a smartphone app. So in the moment in which the patient was consented, the family in reality was consented to enroll in this study, they received a smartphone, and the smartphone had installed only specifically this app that had been designed to communicate with the hospital's electronic files as well, and in which every day they had to insert a series of parameters, mainly the result of their dipstick that they did anyhow every day, the dose of prednisone that they were on, if they had had symptoms that are part of the safety reporting that we needed to do. So fever, cough, asthma, if they'd had a cold, if they'd had diarrhea, vomiting, if they'd performed a vaccination, if they'd taken antibiotics or any other symptoms. And if they responded yes to the safety-related questions, or if the proteinuria that they inputted into the system was not trace or negative, but was more, so 1 + 2 + 3 +, so a significant degree of proteinuria, immediately an alert system went off, and a smartphone that the physicians that were part of the clinical management of the study had, that were on call 24/7, would receive an alert. So they would know that one of the patients enrolled in the study had something, and they would then proceed as rapidly as possible to call back the patient and see what was necessary clinically and what was necessary to record for the patient, for the study to be up to date in terms of safety reporting. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the pros of this was that participating families were really satisfied. It helped enrollment a lot. They were happy to not be required to travel long distances to come into the various different centers that were participating in the study. And it optimized compliance because having the app, if they forgot to do the dipstick, we could call them up and remind them. And so especially with adolescents, this was particularly useful. It also allowed great safety because we could immediately alert the clinical trial medical team if there was any clinical problem or issue with our patients. And it obviously minimized frequency of in-site visits. The cons of this approach, on the other hand, were since it was the first time that this had ever been done, there was a logistic hurdle of creating a platform that were integrated with the hospital electronic medical records system, but this was overcome. We needed to do a bit of training on the use of app, even though honestly most, even adults, the adolescents are great at it, but most adults are now completely able to do this easily. And another con was that at the end of the study, which lasted 24 months, we had a lot of data to analyze, more than we would normally have with different ways of collecting information. And so this was a statistical and a big challenge for our statistical team. So with that, I think I'm done. My last slide, please, is just to thank the different centers that participated in this study. And the principal investigator was my mentor, Professor Francesco Emma, and the main clinician involved in the study was Dr. Antonio Gargiulo. And it was a study that was sponsored by the Italian version of the FDA, the IFA. So I would also like to thank them for allowing this study to be performed. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be very glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Vivarelli. I think we'll move on to the next speaker just so that we can have a little bit longer to have a panel discussion. But I did want to point out to the participants, as Dr. Vivarelli had mentioned, that this trial was constructed before the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it sort of underscores some of my opening comments that these technologies certainly were there and were being used before COVID-19. And again, I think one of the things we hope to get out of this webinar is to look at this as an opportunity to use some well-established technologies to really advance the field and look at it as a great opportunity for us to do our work better. So thank you very much for bringing that to the group's attention. And our next speaker is the CEO and founder of Aparito, who will talk about some of those technologies that Aparito has been involved in. So Dr. Davies.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the previous great talks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the technology that we have in Aparito that was developed and utilized prior to COVID in supporting some hybrid or decentralized sort of study approaches. So firstly, if we move on to the next slide, what I'll do is I'll explain a little bit. Aparito is a 6-year-old company, as I say, and founded on the basis of my pediatric clinical and regulatory experience to try and make the patient experience for the child a little bit easier to take part in clinical trials and you know, for the families in reducing the burden of travel and the burden of time spent in the hospital. Next slide, please. So what we've got at Aparito is a software platform called Atom 5. And it's a highly configurable platform that can be deployed across a wide range of different diseases. We've currently used it in around 18 different therapeutic areas. and it allows patients to onboard themselves and see the patient information sheet and sign. And then obviously for clinicians to be able to see cohort views, but also then individual views, and triage them if there are symptoms that need attention, and communicate directly via the platform to the patient. We adhere by a lot of the ISO standards and security standards to make sure that it's a secure platform for patients' data. Next slide, please. From the patient's point of view or the parent's point of view, they download the study app on their own phone, so we adopt the bring your own device approach, which means it's available in Android and iOS, and we use a QR code system to link it. So there's no patient identifiable data that's required when they download the app in terms of email or phone number or nothing like that. As I say, it's completely configurable in the languages, but also in the number of modules. So you can have a medication adherence module, a PRO module, a real-time symptom module, or an activity one. And what we're seeing now is the use and adoption of video-based assessments or voice-based assessments. And I'll talk through a couple of study examples later on where the patients complete their own standardized assessment at home according to the study protocol. And then they upload those videos via the smartphone, and then it's available in real time for the clinician. We also have the capability to integrate any Bluetooth-enabled devices. So we do have a partnership with Garmin, which means that we have access to all the raw Garmin data, sensor data, but we are hardware agnostic. So we would look to find any assessments, any device, that's suitable for the patient cohort in terms of the disease parameters to be measured, or in terms of the age of the child. And you'll have seen just from that video that was showing there, we are now integrating machine learning pattern recognition capabilities to look at body alignment, such as toe-to-heel lift and sway and sort of cadence and velocity and those kind of things that helps us to support central assessor in an objective assessment of the patient's abilities. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll try and catch up a little bit on time because I think the discussion is really important. These are the therapeutic areas that we are currently working in. We've got a few pivotal regulated studies in gene therapy, lysosomal storage disorders, such as neuronopathic Gaucher disease and Sanfilippo. And then we also have quite a few sort of exploratory development work in the neurodegenerative space. And post-COVID, we now have deployed our technology to support virtual hubs of cancer patients and COVID recovery patients as well. So next slide, please. So this is one of our studies that was up and running prior to COVID, and one of the ones we feel really excited about. It was support medication adherence in children with complex epilepsy, where there was a lot of dose titrations and polypharmacy being attempted to control the seizures at the backdrop of quite complex living situations for these children and families, and some cultural beliefs and stigma associated to the seizures that didn't support medication adherence very well either. So we had the children, families, download the app on their phone and have medication prompts with the correct doses that they were titrating up and down. But crucially, they were also asked to give the reason for non-adherence, and that allowed them to give the real reason if they were or were not taking medication. And we certainly gained a lot of insight about how parents personalize their own medication prescribing according to behavior issues or sleepiness or perceived poor efficacy from the medicine. Over the 6-month study, we had over 2,300 events. The majority of those were seizures reported, and around 70 of them also included videos of the child's seizure, so that the clinician could see the typology of the seizure, as well as reporting behavior issue and sleep issue. The children also wore a wearable device, which indicated a real challenge with sleep and poor quality sleep, which was quite staggering when we saw how little sleep that these children had. But I think a key point for this, experience that we had of working in South Africa is that despite these really challenging environment, there was a fear of theft for the wearable, poor connectivity at time, and electricity outage. We were still able to have extremely insightful data to support the clinical care. Next slide, please. In a complete separate, different approach is work we've done with NHS Wales to develop a bowel and bladder support tool for children who are experiencing incontinence and soiling issues. And so what this app does is try to support the child and family to give immediate response based on wetting accident or soiling incidents. With information, but then provide that information about their diet and their fluid intake to the clinician, so that when the nurse specialists see them in clinic, she can see what their patterns have been over time. Next slide, please. And then just one other example. This is one of the gene therapy studies that I mentioned previously. So in this gene therapy, if we just go back one slide. In the gene therapy study with Sanfilippo, Sanfilippo is much like Batten's disease. It's a very neurodegeneratively progressive diseases that has a multiple of different challenges, and a lot of work has been done on studies sort of halted to date, saying that the neurocognitive tests available in hospital at the moment are not really able to convey things that are important to patients and families, but also in terms of sort of getting the nuances of understanding the disease. So we worked with the patient advocacy groups and the sponsor to develop video-based assessments that were classifying aspects of the disease hallmarks, such as the distressed hyperactivity issues and night waking, but also along with activities of daily living. And this study has been running now for over a year with 20 children treated with gene therapy on it. So it's been a really exciting one to be part of. And then next slide, we'll skip through the next ones quickly because they're primarily adult-based at the moment, but focusing on partnering with DZ&E to convert the severity ataxia rating scale, which is a standardized tool, and converting it into domains that could be done at home and giving instructions to the patients of how to perform the test. I think on the interest of time, Dan, we might just skip this video if that's okay. And another one we're doing is the timed up and go. So again, in adult neurodegenerative patients at the moment, is to utilize the hospital-based test, but to do it remotely in a standardized way that we can then incorporate some of the phases of the test, such as the effort to stand up, the pattern of the gait, the 180-degree turn, and then the sitting back down and the body alignment in that. I realize I'm skipping through it quickly, but I'm sure we're all keen to get to the discussion. So next slide. I think that should be my final one. I hope we've been able to just convey how we've been using our technology to support this concept. Pre-COVID, but certainly now with post-COVID and the need to support pediatric clinical trials more in a patient-centric way, but in a virtual, decentralized way, we see great opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Davies. And now our last speaker, Dr. Alexander, is going to provide or share with us some of his thoughts as a regulator regarding these technologies and the challenges and how we might address them going forward with regard to remote monitoring. So, John, I know you don't have any slides, but I'll hand it over to you to share your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start out by saying what I'm talking about today. The comments that I'm providing are from my own perspective. They don't necessarily represent the policy of the FDA, but I do have a perspective on the conduct of clinical trials, particularly in pediatric patients, that I want to convey, along with giving you a little bit of information about what's been going on at FDA during this COVID pandemic. So I'm sure I don't need to tell all of you about the events that have been going on. From the FDA's perspective, what we've had to do is, with the COVID pandemic and with the separation that has been going on, we've had to try and figure out how to sort of continue our operations, and we've also had to basically scale up a large operation in response to the COVID pandemic itself to look at, in where I am in the Center for Drugs, we've been looking at treatments, we've been looking at availability of things like hand sanitizer. There have been other centers that have had to respond by looking at other aspects of the pandemic response, things like mechanical ventilation equipment needed, PPE needed in the Center for Devices. The Center for Biologics has had to scale up looking at vaccines. So all of that at the same time that we have to deal with what we recognize has been a great impediment to the research that was already underway or previously being planned on products outside of COVID-19. So in recognition of that, FDA has been working on trying to address what's needed in terms of greater flexibility on the part of FDA to try and make sure that we are addressing the needs of the investigator and industry and all the others who are trying to deal with the effects of COVID-19 on their clinical trials, while at the same time still trying to maintain a focus on patient safety. So in the chat, I just sent the name of an FDA guidance that we've put out that tried to address as many of the questions as we could think of at the time related to that type of flexibility that was needed to address how to continue to conduct clinical trials in the setting of this public health emergency. I will note that this guidance is very general. There is one small section among the Q&As that sort of address specifically pediatric requirements for clinical trials, but most of it, as with most FDA guidances, is designed to be broad because we have to address studies of everything from neonates with jaundice to adults with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease in a single guidance that's trying to sort of address what we can do in terms of flexibility. I'd note that the guidance does focus a lot on the idea of making sure that whatever we're doing still maintains a focus on the safety of the patients who are participating in ongoing clinical trials, and thoughts to the safety of the patients, as well as the need for access to treatment for studies that are sort of being planned in these times, because patient care still has to go on. I just had a couple of other comments. So from my perspective, where I sit within looking at pediatric trials, we have always had the concerns that there is a great deal of delay between when a drug is approved in adults and when it can ultimately have clinical trials completed that allow us to make an assessment of the use of that drug in pediatric patients. But we recognize that given the current situation with COVID-19 and the need for social distancing, that there are a lot of other aspects of clinical care that are being either interrupted completely or that still need to go on, but need to go on in a modified way. So I'm really appreciative of hearing all of the prior presentations, as well as wanting to hear a little bit more from the perspectives of the people who are online in the webinar with the issues that you're dealing with, because it helps us to then think about what is going to need to go on from FDA to try and address some of these issues. So we do recognize that we have certain studies that are sort of required for industry to conduct, and we recognize that we're going to have to be flexible. We want to do so, but without or with the least amount of damage to trying to get access to medications to pediatric patients in a timely fashion. And that's a really difficult balance to strike. So with those comments, Gary, I want to turn it back to you and let you begin the question and answer session that you had planned.
Okay, well, thank you, John. Before we start our panel discussion, I was hoping we could see the results of the poll that we asked people to take at the beginning. So you can see there the group, which was close to 100 people for really the entire duration of our webinar. 60% have had experience in patient remote monitoring and 40% haven't. Do you deploy technology to address COVID challenges? You could see that a lot of this technology, at least in this group that was online here, is being driven by COVID-related challenges. And then the last question, if you've used the technology, has it helped you overcome them? Interestingly, 40% have said yes, and then about half of the people said either partially or no. I think it's a good sign that the numbers that said no was 10%, and that there was a good representation of those people who either said partially or completely, I guess, the technology has helped them overcome these challenges. So with that as sort of a summary of the group that we're talking to, I'll open this up for discussion. Cécile has been looking at questions that have come in, and I'll ask Cécile as we start off here, are there questions that you feel would be a good way to start this panel discussion?
Thank you, Gary, and thanks to all the speakers for these very good presentations. We have so far 2 questions that are applicable to all speakers, and it would be great if we could hear from you So the first question comes from Anneke van Abema, and she would like to know if a difference in patients' motivation in participating in clinical trial when they are done by remote monitoring in comparison to conventional methods is the same or has changed. Is it something that you have noticed and shared from your experience? So I don't know who would like to go first.
I can speak to that first.
Yes, thanks.
I think for us here in Canada, it's certainly been a motivating factor, and it's increased our enrollment in clinical trials, being able to do things virtually because we have that widespread outpatient population. So instead of patients coming into the tertiary care centers, they're able to do it from home. We're able to do a little bit more, get creative with our lab work, where we had to bring patients in to draw their labs. Now with some of the changes in the regulations because of COVID, we can set up satellite labs and have lab work being drawn there. So patients maybe have to come in once a month as opposed to weekly. So it's certainly increased enrollment. And then for the example of the clinical trial that I gave, patients were more comfortable just to be at home and in their own space, and when they're not feeling well or things are going on for them, they're in a little bit of a different mindset when they're at home with their family, and they're able to discuss things a little bit more easily than being in a tertiary care setting or clinic setting. So that's just from my perspective.
Brianne, can I just follow up on that? You know, I sense from the way you've responded that, you know, you're assuming or you're experiencing that anecdotally. I wonder if in the MyCERN network, if there wouldn't be interest in actually collecting data on this, so that as we come out of this COVID pandemic, we really see, you know, the positive as well as the negative effects of COVID-19. And I think that would be interesting in terms of advancing the field as the pandemic eventually will disappear, and this remote monitoring, as I think we've said repeatedly, could be very valuable, especially if we all recognize the positive things that come out of it.
Yeah, definitely. I also think that this gives us, COVID gives us even more motivation. So like I said, we had a lot of challenges with pediatric studies and bringing patients in with the way that the Health Canada regulations are. So we couldn't see patients remotely just because of the sponsorship requirements if it was an investigator-initiated study. And so Health Canada is looking at changing their guidelines to a more risk-based approach. And I think that this might give us even more incentive, seeing the possibilities during COVID of why we need to do these pieces and seeing patient perspective. So I certainly think that in the future, it could be something that MyCERN could look at capturing, and then again, presenting more of a case to Health Canada.
Okay, then back to the original question. Other people who'd like to respond to that?
Hi, it's Mark Turner here, just commenting from the C4C point of view. Just as a reminder, C4C is a network across 20 countries in Europe. And another study that we did that is looking at cystic fibrosis addressed this question from the participants' point of view. And they did a survey led by our lead participant, who asked potential participants, what do you think of all of this? If we did this remote monitoring, if we did this remote assessment, if you did your sputums at home, how would that work? And we observed enormous diversity. There wasn't a single approach that people wanted. This was partly because some countries just don't have nurses who can go to the home to administer the medicine. So people just weren't used to that concept. Some countries do not have remote dispensing, so people felt more secure carrying on doing what they always do, rather than trying something like home dispensing for the first time in the middle of the pandemic. So I think we have to start off from the participants and listen to them. And that's one of the advantages of a network like C4C or IACT or the ERNs, is that we have that kind of ability to meet people's needs as they are, rather than assume that everyone's going to leap into using a mobile phone. I don't know about children, but my 83-year-old father had difficulty using his mobile phone during the London Marathon last week. And even the Garmin watch wasn't very easy. So some people do have difficulties, and the role of networks to meet people as they are. And starting off with a participant's view rather than, oh, it's technology, therefore it's great, I think is a really good way forward, and one that we'll be describing in more detail. Thank you.
Emily.
Yeah, so because Batten's disease is such a devastating outcome, our families have a big buy-in. So they know that if what we're doing, the outcome again is the most important part is safety, but the measures for efficacy are so important for these families, for other families in the future, right? So if we needed to watch them very closely. So I think the need to get a hold of the families and to be able to be with them and see them, they know that will change the outcome of such a devastating disease that they are completely, it's a big buy-in. If we say, you know, we got like they can adjust the time, we can talk to them at what, like, of course, because the children have a different time zone and I have a different time zone, you know, especially for the Europeans, we have to pick a specific time where the children are more awake as opposed to, you know, whatever is most convenient for me. So as a primary investigator, I can be talking to them at 5 o'clock in the morning, my time, you know, or 8 o'clock. But again, this is, I think for my disease, and I cannot speak for the other ones, but the parents are just magnificent about responding to telehealth.
Yeah, I think if I can maybe just echo that, from our point of view, we did a survey via Eradis about rare disease patients' perspective of utilizing digital tools for remote patient monitoring, and the response that we got from that Eradis summer school one was overwhelmingly positive to want to utilize this approach. And even if we look at a natural history study in Tay-Sachs that we did at NIH, you know, we had 94% adherence to completing the PROs. And with the wearables, we had something like 87% adherence to wearable over a 6-month natural history study. So I think in the rare disease populations where they are really highly engaged, that they, and also, you know, for these families that travel to hospital, if it's quite a far distance in terms of, you know, logistics, especially when we have some of the gene therapy studies, you know, these patients fly from different countries. So that sort of remote connectivity is really being well received by those specific communities. Flip side, we had a GIA study in adolescent children, and they just didn't find the wearable cool enough and was not so engaged because they wanted an iPhone watch. So you have to be quite responsive to the understanding of the specific patient groups, because one size does not fit all, for sure.
Dr. Vivarelli?
Yeah, I just wanted to share our experience. So the study that I showed was a study that was performed before the COVID pandemic, and it was actually, you know, performed 3 years ago because it lasted 24 months. So it ended at the end of last year. So probably slightly different perspective. But with children with chronic diseases, there are two aspects. One, if they have a rare disease and they need to move, having the possibility of minimizing visits, insight visits, logistically is a huge help. So this was one of the main reasons for which we had enthusiasm. And the other thing was that the app, with the fact that they know that the clinical investigators are continually updated on how the patient is doing, they feel much more taken care of. And we got overwhelmingly positive response from the families in this sense, that, you know, they feel like they're a number, there's a lot of them and very few physicians, but with the app, they felt like they had more of a in-person connection with the investigators. And, you know, 126 is the number of children that completed the study, and it lasted 24 months, and we only had one patient or family that dropped out for non-compliance. We had other dropouts because they failed the treatment for other reasons, but that is staggeringly high in my experience compared to other studies that we've run. So we really had the impression that the app was something that really engaged the families and helped them to stay in a long study. And so that would be definitely my impression, independently from the COVID pandemic.
That's great. And that's the kind of data that I was referring to sort of continue to generate, so that we really do, in a data-driven way, understand how remote monitoring is improving the way we do our work. Cécile, did you have another question you wanted to ask the panelists, or that came in from the participants?
Yes, no, thank you, Gary. There was one question from Alberto Tozzi, where he would like to know about the use of wearables and other digital instruments for remote monitoring, and how easy or how it is well accepted by the patients and their families. I think we touched upon slightly on this topic in the previous question, but maybe I would like to re-emphasize the need to work with the patients and the families with technology, and somebody from the panelists have something to add on how do they generate this work, this collaborative work with the patients and families.
I mean, we have now 8 different therapeutic, pediatric therapeutic areas that we've had children use wearable devices. You know, we learned very quickly that children with Niemann-Pick C who have behavioral issues would sometimes find it quite difficult, and they were biting through the strap because they liked the texture of the strap. Whereas the Duchenne boys, because they had slightly different behavioral issues, couldn't cope with the asymmetric shape of the wearable that they'd been given, or they had particularly sensitivity sort of skin aspect, so they weren't so keen on the touch. The GIA teenagers, I already explained, they wanted something really trendy, so they were not so keen on not having a very trendy one. But then we have, you know, the complex epilepsy ones, that they were actually very well tolerated by those young children. And so it's quite variable and disease specific, I would say, that you do need to consider the type of wearable and the burden of wearing it, if it sort of requires charging all the time and that kind of thing.
Others on the panel? Let me ask a question, or I just make an observation, and then maybe people on the panel can add to that observation. You know, we're very much focused on clinical research and how remote monitoring will be used in clinical research, but I think we also recognize that as a result of the pandemic, the healthcare systems have been responding by just routinely monitoring their patients' health remotely. I would envision, and I think we're already seeing, I appreciate panelists also sharing their observations, how remote monitoring has become more embedded in just routine practice, pediatrics and in adults. And I wonder if, as a group, we would certainly expect that as healthcare begins to change, more of it being conducted remotely, whether or not that wouldn't also logically have a great impact on how we could develop clinical trials that would sort of align with the way we deliver routine healthcare. I know Mark made a comment that, you know, when you're talking about a diverse population, you certainly can get a great deal of diversity in terms of the comfort of working with remote monitoring. But I think many of us are seeing in our healthcare systems the push to remotely care for our patients. So I appreciate some comments from the panelists on how they see those two things working together, complementing and sort of moving the field together. Routine care, and now it's going to be translated eventually into how we need to construct and design our clinical trials.
For me, across the whole of health informatics, or whatever you want to call it, it's about getting buy-in from all the people who need to get buy-in. And I think we're just about learning that we should talk to the people who are going to wear the wearable before making any assumptions about them. I know Ellen and Cécile and others are great at that. But that needs to be brought into study design as well as routine healthcare. And quite often the participants in the studies are neglected until quite late in the process, so I'd champion that. The other group that gets left out quite often in all of health informatics are people like nurses who actually have to use it from day to day. electronic healthcare records are very rarely built from the nurse's view upwards, despite the fact the nurse or whoever it is working with it most commonly. And this is often a big problem with the acceptability of EHR and everything else. So I think we should move beyond being a learning healthcare system into being a learning healthcare community that starts off with all of these people, and that applies in healthcare and in research. And the rush towards technology can leave people behind. It can lock people into situations they don't really enjoy. I mean, that's my experience of talking to any nurse that's ever worked with an electronic health record. And I think we should be cognizant of those problems across all the topics that Gary's mentioned.
Other panelists?
Sure, this is John. So if I could add, I mean, I think that we've recognized the great interest that's just been accelerated by COVID that patients had previously for their own convenience, not having to travel to different sites. I personally have worked in various different settings. So I live in Washington, D.C. now, which is a densely populated urban center where we had no concerns necessarily with having individuals sort of in our area in that dense population come into a center for the purposes of being evaluated for just their clinical care. But I've also worked in settings out in rural Wyoming where it was a burden and patients were coming 4 or 8 hours to drive in order to bring their patient in for just their well child visit. So the idea that patients have always sort of had an interest in sort of looking at what would be convenient for them has been something that we should be taking into account. But I think that the idea of talking about this concept from all of the community also means that the individuals who are investigators, the industry who are sponsoring clinical trials, the different groups that are sort of involved in saying we need to answer these research questions also need to recognize from their own perspective, how do we incorporate this and the desire of these patients to be able to do something that's a little bit more convenient? Because I do recognize from seeing different studies at FDA that there is a lot of focus on what we can measure objectively, and that usually involves sort of clinic visits or patients coming in for blood tests or things like that as the main thing that a lot of physicians are interested in. And we have to get out of that mindset in order to be able to say, what can we do more remotely that is more related to what the patient themselves feels or would improve their condition in their lives.
Thank you, John.
I have to go for telehealth. So
yeah, no.
Yeah, and Shelley will stay, but I echo those sentiments. So I think moving forward, when the next trial, my next trial design, obviously I'll have to build in just in case, a option B. Again, I think like but we have to follow the rule of the protocol as FDA says. But I think what we need to do in the future is be able to have options for studies so that, if you go from a cognitive study where it's live, you have to be able to shift, to be able to get a cognitive study that's more of an interview, so I think we have to design those things ourselves. But I think telehealth is here to stay, and in fact I have to go now because I have a telehealth, and it's quite convenient for the families, especially in challenging situations. But I think best of luck to everybody. I think this is an exciting time to be in terms of precision medicine, but Shelley is here to stay.
Well, thank you, but I think we're all going to have to leave because we're out of time here. And I want to thank, again, Aparito for organizing this and putting this together. I welcome continued progress in this area. And, we'll look forward with working with all of you in innovating and improving the way we do clinical research involving children. So thanks again, and we're going to sign off.